It was a peaceful morning, the kind that made you feel like everything was right in the world. The sun had barely risen, its golden rays peeking through the trees, casting long shadows across the lake. I sat on the porch of my grandfather's lakefront cabin, sipping my coffee, listening to the soft lapping of water against the dock. For 6 years, this had been my sanctuary. A place where I could escape the noise of the world, work from home, and live in the quiet comfort that only a lake house could offer. I was 34 years old, a software engineer who specialized in property management systems. My work was remote, which gave me the freedom to live in places like this, far away from the noise and rush of city life. My grandfather had passed this land down to me when I was 28, and in the years since, I had slowly turned it into the perfect retreat. The house sat on Crystal Lake, nestled among pine trees, with a dock my grandfather built by hand in 1962. It was simple and rustic, but it was home. The kind of place where the only thing you had to worry about was the weather, and maybe whether you had enough firewood to last the winter. Life had been good. Not perfect, but peaceful. I never asked for more than this. It felt like I had everything a person could need. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, everything changed. Her name was Melinda Rohr. She showed up at my doorstep carrying a clipboard like it was some kind of royal scepter, wearing an oversized yellow cardigan that looked out of place for the crisp autumn weather. She was flanked by 2 people I didn't recognize, Dennis and Vivian Cole. The moment I saw them, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal visit. I could feel the weight of what was coming, even before they spoke. "Mr. Harris," Melinda said without any pleasantries, "I'm here to inform you of several violations that need immediate attention." I blinked, processing the words that felt like they came out of nowhere. "What kind of violations?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. I was hoping she had the wrong house, or that this was some kind of misunderstanding. She didn't answer me directly. Instead, she waved a piece of paper in front of me, like it was a court order. "Your dock is an unauthorized structure that presents a liability risk to our community," she said, as if she were reading from some rulebook. "And your lakefront access violates our landscaping standard." I stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. My grandfather's dock had been here long before any of these houses or the HOA ever existed. It was built with care, maintained with pride, and had stood the test of time for over 50 years. It wasn't just a dock, it was a symbol of family history, of everything my grandfather had worked for. And now, it was being reduced to a liability risk? Community standards? I asked, trying to understand. "This dock has been here since 1962, long before any of these houses were built. It was my grandfather's pride, and it's been maintained properly for decades." Melinda didn't even blink. She pointed to the dock with a pen as though she was identifying evidence at a crime scene. "Just because something has been here for a long time doesn't mean it's legal or safe," she said, her voice condescending, her tone dripping with authority. "That structure is not up to current safety codes, and frankly, it's an eyesore that affects property values for everyone else." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about safety or property values. This was about power. Melinda was flexing her position as the new president of the HOA, and she was using it to bully me, to make me bend to her will. And I wasn't going to let her do it. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm, "I'm happy to discuss any legitimate concerns you have, but this dock is part of my family's history. It's been here for over 50 years, and it's been maintained properly. If there's a specific safety issue, I'll be glad to address it. But this isn't just about a dock. This is about you and your HOA trying to control something that isn't yours." Melinda's face twisted into something that almost looked like a smile, but it was more of a grimace. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Harris. You have 21 days to remove the unauthorized structure and bring your property into compliance with community standards, or we will escalate the enforcement procedures," she said, as though she was handing down a sentence. I watched as she handed me the violation notice, the bold letters at the bottom demanding that I comply or face legal action. I felt the blood rush to my head. This wasn't just about a dock or some arbitrary rules. This was about my grandfather's legacy. This was about standing up for what was mine, what was rightfully ours. As Melinda and her followers walked away, I looked down at the violation notice in my hands and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to give in to this petty, power-hungry HOA president. I was going to fight back, but not in the way she expected. I was going to do my research, learn the law, and show her exactly what happens when you mess with someone who knows their rights. Little did I know, the ground I was standing on was far more solid than anyone could have imagined. And Melinda Rohr had just made the biggest mistake of her life by picking a fight with the one person who owned the land beneath her feet. The next few days felt like a whirlwind, my mind spinning with all the things I needed to figure out. The violation notice burned a hole in my pocket, a constant reminder that Melinda wasn't going to back down easily. But I wasn't about to let her win. I had my grandfather's legacy to protect, and I wasn't going to let some self-appointed HOA president come in and rip it away from me without a fight. I spent hours that first night researching property laws, digging through county records, and going through my grandfather's old papers. I wasn't just looking for a loophole, I was looking for the truth. I needed to understand exactly what legal ground I was standing on, what rights I had over the land and the property surrounding it. The more I dug, the more I realized that Melinda and her HOA didn't have a leg to stand on. What they were doing wasn't just rude, it was illegal. But I wasn't going to confront Melinda just yet. I had to be strategic about this. I needed to make sure I had all my ducks in a row before I made my move. And so, I began planning. I would go to the HOA office and speak to her directly, try to resolve the issue without escalating things, but if that didn't work, I was prepared to take legal action. I just needed to gather more evidence. The next morning, I made my way to the Lakeshore HOA office. It was tucked behind Dennis and Vivian Cole's house, a small, converted garage that looked more like a storage shed than an official office. As I walked up the driveway, I could hear the sounds of papers shuffling and faint voices inside. Melinda was there, no doubt, working on some new way to get me to comply with her ridiculous demands. I knocked on the door and waited. A few moments later, Melinda opened the door, her yellow cardigan even more disheveled than before. She looked at me with a cold expression, as if I was an annoyance rather than a concerned homeowner. "Mr. Harris," she said, her tone clipped. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm here to discuss the violation notice you issued," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I want to understand exactly what concerns you have, and see if we can come to a reasonable solution." She sighed, her eyes narrowing in disbelief, as though I was wasting her time. "We've already been over this, Mr. Harris. The dock is unauthorized, and your property does not meet the community standards. We've given you the violation notice, and you have 21 days to comply." "I've read the notice," I said, holding it up in front of her. "But I don't think you fully understand the history of this property, and the agreement that's been in place for decades. This land has been in my family's name for generations, and my grandfather made arrangements with the people who live here long before any HOA existed." Her face flickered with irritation. "Your grandfather may have made some arrangements, but that doesn't change the fact that this is a community, and we have rules that need to be followed." "That's where you're wrong," I said, leaning in slightly. "The rules you're enforcing are not only unnecessary, but they're illegal. The land under this cabin, under every house in this community, still belongs to my family. Your so-called community standards don't apply because you don't actually own the land. My grandfather was generous, but he never gave up ownership. And if you look at the county records, you'll see exactly what I mean." Her face went pale for a moment, and she quickly regained her composure. "You're making all of this up to avoid following the rules," she said, her voice now shaky. "I'm not making anything up," I replied, standing up straight. I have the official records from the county. I have evidence, and I'll make sure the whole community knows the truth." With that, I turned to leave, but not before I saw the flicker of panic in Melinda's eyes. I knew that the truth was starting to sink in. She had no idea what she was up against. And neither did most of the other homeowners in the neighborhood. The next few days were a blur. I worked during the day, but at night, I kept digging through my grandfather's old documents. I went through his property surveys, his old letters, and anything that might shed light on the history of this land. And then, I found it. An old cassette tape, labeled Property Agreement 1972. It was a recording of my grandfather's voice, a clear, steady voice, as he outlined the agreements he had made with the people who lived on the property. The recording confirmed everything. My grandfather had allowed families to build homes on the land, but he had never transferred ownership. He had kept the land in the Harris family name and had simply allowed the families to use the land temporarily. It was a handshake agreement, an agreement based on trust, on the kindness of a man who believed in helping others when they were struggling. But Melinda and her HOA had no idea what they were up against. They were threatening the very people who had been living on land that wasn't even theirs. I couldn't believe it. My grandfather had known this day would come. He had prepared for it. He had documented everything, kept records, and made sure that no one could claim ownership of this land without his family's consent. It was all there, in black and white. The discovery of the tape changed everything. I knew that I had to act fast. Melinda had no idea what was coming her way. She thought she was dealing with a simple homeowner who wouldn't know how to defend his property, but now I had something far more powerful than any complaint or legal threat, the truth. And with the truth on my side, I knew I could take back control of the situation. The next morning, I called Walter. I needed his help. Walter was the former HOA president, the man who had seen it all, and I trusted him to guide me through the next steps. When I arrived at his house, he didn't waste any time. He knew exactly what to do. "You've got the smoking gun now," Walter said, his voice low and serious. "You need to go to the county recorder's office, make sure they have the original property records. If this tape is right, you're going to find that this whole neighborhood is built on your family's land. And that means Melinda has no legal right to issue any violations or fees. You've got the upper hand, but you need to be smart about how you use it." I nodded. Walter had spent years surveying properties in the area, and his knowledge of the land was unparalleled. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. I made plans to go to the county recorder's office first thing the next day. The truth had to come out, and I was going to make sure it did. That evening, I spent hours going through the documents my grandfather had kept: maps, old letters, property deeds. Each document painted a picture of a time when things were simpler, when people didn't need contracts or lawyers to do what was right. My grandfather had always believed in doing the right thing by his neighbors, and now, his actions were going to protect not just my land but the people who had unwittingly become part of this dispute. When the sun came up the next morning, I was ready. I drove to the county recorder's office, my hands tight on the steering wheel as I thought about what was at stake. This wasn't just about a dock or a piece of land, it was about the integrity of my family's legacy and the people who had been taken advantage of. I wasn't going to let Melinda get away with what she had done. The clerk at the recorder's office was a woman named Patricia. I could tell from her expression that she had seen a lot in her years working there, but even she was taken aback when she listened to the tape. "Mr. Harris," she said, after listening to the recording with growing amazement. "If what this tape says is true, we need to pull the original property records and verify the chain of ownership. This is unprecedented." I watched as she disappeared into the back room, and a few hours later, she came back with a thick folder of documents. As she laid them out in front of me, I could see the confusion on her face. The records were clear: my family still owned the land under the entire community. It wasn't just my cabin or the dock. It was every house, every property, every piece of land that Melinda and the other homeowners had been living on. They had all been living on borrowed land, land that was never legally transferred to them. Patricia looked at the documents, then back at me. "Mr. Harris, I've been working here for 23 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. This changes everything." I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The truth was now in my hands, and Melinda's power was crumbling faster than she could realize. But I knew I couldn't just walk away now. I had to make sure the entire community knew the truth, and that meant bringing the records to the people who needed to hear them the most. I headed back to my cabin, the weight of the documents heavy in my hands. I called Walter and told him what had happened. He was just as stunned as I was. "You've got it now," he said. "The rest of the community needs to see these records. They need to know that Melinda's been living on your land without permission. It's time for her to face the consequences." That night, I did something I hadn't planned on. I made copies of the county records, the property surveys, and the cassette tape. I laminated them and put them up on the bulletin board outside the HOA office. I knew Melinda would be furious, but it was time for the truth to be laid out for everyone to see. It was time for her to face the reality that she had been living on borrowed land all along, and that her attempts to control the neighborhood were about to come crashing down. The next morning, I saw the first signs of change. People were stopping to look at the documents on the bulletin board, reading through them in shock. I could hear whispers in the air as the community began to realize what had been happening. They were living on land that legally belonged to me, and Melinda had been issuing violations and fines without any legal right to do so. By noon, the crowd around the bulletin board had grown, and I could see more and more neighbors talking, their faces a mix of disbelief and concern. Tanya Schmidt, the single mother who had been harassed by Melinda, was there, too. She had her phone out, recording everything for social media. I knew that once this information spread, Melinda wouldn't be able to control the narrative anymore. And sure enough, Melinda came storming out of the HOA office around 1 p.m. I could see her yellow cardigan from a distance, flapping in the wind as she marched toward the bulletin board. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with panic. She had no idea how bad this was going to get. "What is this?" she shouted, ripping the documents off the board and tearing them into pieces. "This is fake. This is all lies." But her frantic actions only fueled the fire. As she destroyed the documents, people started recording. I saw Tanya move closer, her camera focused on Melinda's every move. "Why are you destroying official county documents?" Tanya called out, her voice loud and clear. "Are you trying to hide something?" Melinda froze, her hands shaking as she looked around at the growing crowd. It was too late for her to back out now. The damage had been done. The chaos that erupted after Melinda started tearing up the county records felt almost surreal. I had expected her to be upset, sure, but I never imagined she would lose control like this. Watching her flail in the face of her own lies was strangely satisfying, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. She had made a mess of things, but it was time to end this once and for all. I wasn't just going to let her slip away with her actions unnoticed. No, this was going to be her reckoning. As the crowd gathered around Melinda, their phones out, recording every embarrassing moment, I stood back for a moment, taking it all in. This was it. This was the moment I'd been working toward, the moment when I was finally going to reclaim control of not just my land but also my family's legacy. And Melinda, in her yellow cardigan and frantic attempts to tear up the truth, was going to have to face the consequences. But I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone in this community who had been manipulated, harassed, and subjected to her petty power trips. People like Tanya, who had worked 2 jobs just to keep her home and was now fighting for her right to stay there without the constant pressure of arbitrary fines. This was for all the people Melinda had targeted, the ones who had no idea what they were up against until it was almost too late. I walked over to the crowd, my footsteps steady, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. Melinda noticed me approaching and her eyes narrowed in a mix of fear and anger. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, her voice cracking with frustration. "This doesn't change anything. You can't just show up with a few pieces of paper and claim ownership of everything. I'm still the president of this community, and I still have the authority to make the rules." I shook my head slowly, the weight of the moment not lost on me. "You're wrong, Melinda," I said, my voice calm, even. "You never had the authority to begin with. Everything you've done, from issuing fines to sending fake inspectors to harassing people, none of it was legal. And now, it's all coming to light." She recoiled at my words, but I wasn't finished. I stepped forward, addressing the crowd who had gathered, their phones still recording everything. "This is for all of you," I said, my gaze sweeping over the neighbors, some of whom looked worried, while others had looks of anger, realization, and even relief. "For everyone who's been living in fear of arbitrary fines and fake violations. For the people who have been silenced by power-hungry individuals who think they can control your lives. We've been living under a system that wasn't just flawed, it was corrupt." I paused, letting my words sink in. The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel the eyes of the community on me, waiting for what I would say next. We don't need a tyrant running this community. We need fairness. We need transparency. And we need a leader who actually cares about the well-being of everyone, not just their own agenda. Melinda opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, signaling for silence. "And that's why," I continued, "I'm offering a solution. I'm not here to take people's homes. I'm offering a fair lease arrangement for everyone. For just $200 a month, you can have security, stability, and a clear understanding of where you stand legally. No more surprise fees, no more fabricated fines. Just a fair agreement that honors my family's legacy and allows everyone to continue living in peace." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, people starting to talk amongst themselves. Some looked at me with skepticism, while others began to nod, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. They had been living on land that technically belonged to my family, but I wasn't asking them to leave. I was offering them a chance to stay, legally, with fair terms that would protect them. Melinda, however, wasn't hearing any of it. Her face was a mask of rage now, and her voice shook with fury as she shouted, "You can't do this. You can't just come in here and take everything we've built. This is extortion." I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "What you've built is based on lies, Melinda. You've been taking advantage of your position to exploit people, and now the truth is out. You can't bully people into submission anymore." She took a step back, her chest rising and falling with each breath. "You don't know what you're doing. You think you're going to get away with this?" "I already have," I replied. "And so have the rest of us. You've lost, Melinda." The crowd was now fully engaged, some cheering, others still processing what was happening. The once formidable HOA president was no longer the powerful figure she had been just hours before. She was unraveling in front of everyone, and there was no escape for her. Just then, a familiar voice rang out from the back of the crowd. It was Vivian, and she stepped forward, holding up a printed email in front of everyone. "I think everyone needs to hear this," she said, her voice steady. "Melinda's been using the HOA funds for personal expenses. She's been paying fake inspectors, charging for services that were never provided, and even using the community's money for groceries. I think it's time everyone knew what's been going on behind the scenes." Vivian handed the email to the nearest person, who began reading it aloud. As the words echoed through the crowd, the realization hit everyone like a ton of bricks. Melinda had been using the HOA as her personal cash cow, draining the funds and abusing her position for her own gain. The crowd grew restless, their disbelief turning to anger. "Melinda," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos, "this is the end for you. The community's seen the truth, and they know what's really been going on. You've been caught red-handed." She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She knew it was over. Her reign had crumbled in front of her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Walter stood up, calling for order in the meeting, while Vivian and I handed out copies of the email and documents proving Melinda's corruption. The community was in shock, but it was clear, Melinda's time as president was up. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. The community voted to remove Melinda from her position, and Walter was appointed as the interim president until a proper election could be held. Melinda tried to argue, but her words were drowned out by the voices of the people who had finally found their voice. As the meeting concluded, I took a moment to look around. This was it, the moment everything had changed. The people of this community had stood up for what was right, and now they had a chance to build something better. The days after the meeting felt surreal, like the calm after a storm. I could still hear the echoes of the chaos in my head, the sound of Melinda's desperate shouts, the murmurs of shock and disbelief from the community members who had just witnessed the unraveling of their so-called leader. But as the dust settled, there was a sense of peace that began to settle over Crystal Lake, the calm of a battle won, but not without its scars. The day after the meeting, I went down to the cabin early, as I usually did, and sat on the dock, just watching the water ripple. It was a moment of stillness, one that I hadn't had in a long time. The pressure, the fight, the constant battle against a system that was rigged against me, it all seemed like a distant memory now. And yet, I knew the real work was just beginning. I wasn't going to just let this moment of victory slip by. I had to ensure that the lessons learned here were not forgotten, that the community would remain vigilant in its defense of what was right. The first phone call I got that morning was from Walter. "You've done it, Colton," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "The community's finally free of that woman. But now, we've got a bigger job ahead of us." I knew exactly what he meant. The next step wasn't just about getting rid of Melinda. It was about rebuilding the HOA, restoring faith in the community, and making sure that nothing like this ever happened again. The truth about Melinda had come to light, but there were still people in the community who were afraid, who didn't fully understand what was at stake. I spent the next few days meeting with neighbors, having long conversations with people like Tanya, the single mother who had been so afraid of losing her home just days before, and Vivian, who was now firmly on the side of justice. I had to assure them that the changes we were making weren't just about bringing Melinda down, they were about creating a better future, one that wasn't built on fear or manipulation. One evening, I sat with Tanya and Walter on the dock, just looking out at the water. The sky was streaked with hues of pink and orange, the sun setting gently over the lake. It was a peaceful moment, but the reality of what had happened over the last few months was still fresh in my mind. "I never thought this place would turn into what it did," Tanya said, her voice filled with disbelief. "I mean, I thought the HOA was supposed to help us. But all they did was make our lives harder. I don't think I could have gone another month with all the stress. Now, it feels like a weight has been lifted." Walter nodded, his weathered face lined with the years of experience that had allowed him to see through Melinda's schemes. "You're right, Tanya. We've been living in a shadow for too long. But the light's starting to shine through now. Colton's done what nobody else could, and now it's time to take back what's ours." I could feel the weight of Walter's words. It wasn't just about what Melinda had done, it was about what the community had allowed to happen. The power of the HOA wasn't some abstract concept, it was tangible, it was real, and it had been used to hurt good people for far too long. Now, we had the chance to change that. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, planning, and organizing. The community came together in a way that I had never seen before. We were no longer a collection of individuals living in fear of arbitrary fines and false accusations. We were a united group of people, ready to fight for fairness, transparency, and justice. Vivian, now fully on board with the changes, took on a leadership role in organizing the new bylaws. Walter, ever the steady hand, helped ensure that we put the right systems in place to protect the community from future corruption. Tanya, despite her initial fears, became one of the most vocal advocates for the new structure, ensuring that everyone had a say and that no one would be left behind. And then, there was the matter of Melinda. She had left the community, but her actions weren't going to be swept under the rug. I knew that she wouldn't give up easily. People like her rarely do. But I wasn't about to let her poison this place any longer. We made sure that the story of what happened was known. We wanted everyone to understand just how far one person had gone to manipulate an entire neighborhood, and how a single act of standing up to that power had changed everything. The legal work was also intense. We filed the necessary paperwork to formalize the new ownership agreements for the land that had been in the Harris family for generations. It wasn't just about ensuring that people had a place to live, it was about protecting that land, ensuring that it would always remain a sanctuary for those who respected it and its history. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see the fruits of our labor. The new HOA leadership, under Walter's steady guidance, started to enact real change. The first thing we did was lower the fees. No more $1,200 fines for things as simple as a mailbox being painted the wrong color. We brought in professionals to maintain the common areas, making sure that money was being spent responsibly and that the community would benefit, not just the HOA board members. But more importantly, we restored the trust that had been lost. People started to feel like they mattered again. They had a voice. They had a say in how things were done, and they were no longer living in fear of a corrupt system that didn't care about them. I sat down on my grandfather's dock one evening, watching the sun set over Crystal Lake, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, there were still things to be done, and I knew that I would have to stay vigilant. But the fight had been won. The community had stood together, and we had done what was right. In the end, it wasn't about the land. It wasn't about the dock or the fines or the arbitrary rules. It was about standing up for what was right, about showing people that they didn't have to accept injustice. And as I sat there, watching the water lap against the shore, I knew that my grandfather's legacy would live on, not just in the land, but in the spirit of the community that had come together to protect it. This place, Crystal Lake, the land beneath my feet, was more than just property. It was home. And that's what mattered most. The days that followed marked the true beginning of a new chapter for both the Lakeshore community and me. While the shadows of the past still lingered, they no longer held the power they once did. The change in the air was palpable. People who had once walked with their heads down, afraid to challenge the system, now held their heads high. The fear was gone, replaced by an unspoken understanding. We had survived a storm, and we had emerged stronger, more united, and ready to protect what was ours. I had spent years living in the serenity of my grandfather's cabin, believing that the simple life I had crafted there was all I needed. But now, I understood that life was about more than just the peace of the water and the whispers of the pines. It was about the people you shared it with, the community you nurtured, and the principles that guided you. The fight had shown me that it wasn't enough to just be content with what I had. I had a responsibility, not just to myself, but to the land, the people, and the legacy my grandfather had left me. Walter continued to play an instrumental role in guiding the community toward stability. The bylaws we had written were beginning to take shape, and the financial mismanagement that had plagued the HOA was being corrected. The fees had been brought back to reasonable levels, and funds were being allocated properly for the upkeep of common spaces. The transparency that we had worked so hard to establish began to show results. There were no more arbitrary fines or hidden agendas, everything was out in the open for everyone to see. Tanya, who had once been terrified of losing her home, found new strength. She helped organize community gatherings where people could voice their concerns, discuss ideas for improvement, and get to know one another better. The lakeshore community was no longer a place of isolation and division. It had become a place where people supported each other, where every voice mattered. And it wasn't just about keeping things peaceful, it was about thriving, about improving, and about building a future together. Vivian, once caught in the middle, became one of the most valuable assets in the rebuilding process. Her honesty and willingness to stand up against the wrongs of the past inspired others to do the same. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the community's new values, honesty, accountability, and fairness, were woven into every decision we made. As for Melinda, her departure from the community was a stark reminder of the power that individuals could wield when they understood the law, when they stood together in the face of injustice. I had never intended to run the HOA or become a figurehead in the community. My fight wasn't about power, it was about preserving what was right. But sometimes, doing the right thing meant stepping into a leadership role and helping others see that they had the strength to fight for themselves. I had one final conversation with Walter, standing on the dock that my grandfather had built all those years ago. The water was calm, the air cool, and the sky was streaked with soft colors as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a moment of peace, the kind that I had been longing for throughout the entire battle. "I didn't expect any of this," I said, looking out at the water. "I just wanted to live in peace, you know. But it's so much more than that now. This land, this community. It's not just about me anymore. It's about all of us." Walter placed a hand on my shoulder, his weathered face calm as ever. "You've learned what many never do, Colton. It's not enough to just stand by. You have to protect what's yours, protect those who can't protect themselves. And sometimes, that means fighting when you don't want to. But the good thing is, when you fight for the right reasons, people will stand with you. You've proven that." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. The words felt true, but they were hard to accept. My grandfather had always been the calm one, the one who knew how to take care of things. I had never expected to follow in his footsteps. But in many ways, I realized, I had. We stood there in silence for a while, just watching the water, listening to the wind. The world was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, it felt right. Over the following weeks, things began to return to normal. But it wasn't the same kind of normal it had been before Melinda arrived. This new normal was one where people didn't just live next to each other, they lived for each other. People who had once barely spoken to their neighbors were now sharing stories over coffee, helping one another with repairs, and even organizing community cleanups. The transformation was slow, but it was real. And me? Well, I continued my work. I spent my days programming and managing properties, just like before. But now, when I came home to the cabin, it felt different. It was no longer just a retreat from the world, it had become a symbol of the strength and resilience of the community I had helped protect. The cabin had always been my sanctuary, but now, it felt like a home, one that was a part of something much bigger than myself. The journey had been long and filled with challenges I never could have anticipated, but looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. The fight had tested my limits, had pushed me further than I thought I could go. But in the end, it had made me stronger. It had made the community stronger. So, with that said, thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking with me through the twists and turns of this journey. It's been a wild ride, one that I won't soon forget. And I hope that this story reminds you of one thing: sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in courtrooms or boardrooms, they're fought in the hearts of the people who are willing to stand up for what's right. Until next time, take care. Keep fighting for what matters most, and never let anyone take what's yours.